Hey, this is Jack, and in this video I want to talk about what I think isn't getting talked about when it comes to the war in Ukraine. So let's start off by in some way sharing the obvious. Like, this is tragic. It's almost unconscionable, the level of suffering that this is creating. I'm sure I don't even know the half of it, but the half that I do know is it's completely unacceptable. It's regrettable. I feel disappointed that I'm becoming normalized to the headlines about this, because this isn't normal. This isn't how we want to proceed in the 21st century. But given that this is happening, I want to talk about what it might actually take to stop something like this happening in the future. Right? The main Western political media narrative on this is about Russia as a bad actor, and as well, that may be true. Right? We live in a world that includes good and bad actors, and they're not always the same people all the time. And so in most of the world as we know it, we have ways of dealing with that, right? That's one of the reasons that we have a judicial system and a court system, is that when people have grievances, sometimes it needs to be turned over to, as best as we've been able to construct it, and it can always be better, obviously, but to a third party, to an impartial arbiter, to come up with some kind of settlement. That one of the main reasons to do that is actually to prevent violence, right? Lots of people who are in prison or serving punishment sentences believe they were doing so for a good reason, right? Maybe they were motivated by revenge. Maybe they felt that something wasn't unfair, right? Of course, there's a proportion of people who we would deem sociopathic, or it's just better that we remove them from society for society's safety. But that's probably not actually the majority. It's probably very far from the majority of people who are dealt with through the courts. And so what I'm trying to say is, we know some stuff about how to have processes that address grievances, that address legitimate grievances, and bring people into a process that has due process, that has an actual stated and objective process attached to it, and that comes out with a settlement that you may or may not like if you're involved in that process. But generally, it's got the legitimacy that people mostly accept it, and that it mostly results in a de-escalation of violence, right? Which is what we want, right? So when the world looks at this situation in Ukraine, what everyone really wants, and has been calling for from the beginning, is a de-escalation of the violence. Now, obviously, on both sides, there's going to be a set of conditions probably attached to that that's going to be hard to agree on. But the challenge is, there's no place to refer this to say, okay, let's deal with this, right? Even if you're fully in the perspective that this is a Russian war of aggression, when we think about due process in the court system, we have a way of dealing with that, right? We have a way of dealing with crimes that are purely acts of aggression. So what I'm pointing to, and this isn't like a particularly sexy topic, but when it comes to I was just reading this morning that they think the estimates of Ukrainian lives lost in this war are vastly too low, right? So when it comes, you're talking about thousands of people dying. What can you do? Well, what you can do is actually be part of the conversation and the thinking about, well, how would we actually stop this happening? Right? We could say, well, you remove Putin, or replace dictators with more democratic forms of governance. In the fullness of time, that may happen. Right now, that isn't happening, and we also have some recent experiences, obviously, in Iraq of what can happen when you remove the top person from a more dictatorial style of regime. The other thing that's always happening in the background here is the West, to some extent, is acting as police person. And to me, that ultimately is the best that we've come up with right now, but it's problematic because the West isn't an unobjective agent in the way that we would mostly expect a judge or a jury or a judicial system to operate. Right? The West has its own interests. So when there are politicians in the West that call the West hypocritical for labeling certain wars, crimes of aggression and war crimes, when the West perpetrates its own wars that some people at least feel could be described similarly, you get that the West is in a sort of a precarious moral position here. And I'm not making the West wrong for that. That's in some ways the situation that we find ourselves in the world. But what if we had some kind of impartial higher authority that this could be referred to, right? That's the principle that happens all the way up through the court system, is if this court isn't competent to try this crime, we push it up the line. Or if we don't feel like we've got a fair trial, we might refer it to an appellate court and a court of appeal. And they're going to rule on whether that's the case or not. Europe bandied together as, initially the European Economic Community and eventually the European Union. But one of the main drivers for that was to prevent countries going to war. Right? Now, there's many factors that have gone into the fact that we haven't had war in Europe in the last several decades. One of them is the European Union, and there are others, American security guarantees, the fact that Europe relatively, for a lot of that time, was also economically on its knees, that we've had a somewhat bipolar and then kind of unipolar world, although that's shifting obviously with the rise of China. But there's been a sort of clarity in global power politics. So the interesting thing is, within a country, you might have a fully functioning judicial system and democratic government, even as I say, we can continue to perfect those things. Between countries, in some ways, it's the law of the jungle still, right? And this is the bit that I don't think gets named and called out as much as it could. So, yes, countries can exist with treaties, but you'll probably know this. In Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons under a treaty with the US and Russia to guarantee its security. And obviously now it's one of those countries is invading it. So international treaties, absent some kind of due process, place of authority to refer them to, it's kind of limited, right? Because at some level a country can just say, and this happens with nuclear treaties, at some point a country is just going to say, well, I'm done, I'm going to opt out, right? Or look at how Trump did with the Paris Climate Accords, just sort of say, okay, I'm kind of done here. Now you could say, well, that's fair enough because that's the democratic will of a democratic country. But what happens when your democratic country gets invaded by a stronger country? I mean, that's in some ways the situation that the Ukrainians find themselves in at the moment. And so the West is taking a line. The West is unveiling, led by Washington, a whole set of sanctions against Russia. And you might say the West is doing a skillful job of trying to bring sanctions to bear, but treading this fine line so that they don't get embroiled into World War III. But ultimately, are those sanctions moral and just when they are delivered by one powerful country and its allies onto another country? From a Russian perspective, you could see that's not gonna seem just, right? That's not an impartial process. That's a Western strategic interest-backed process. Now, again, you could say, well, that's what states do. States pursue their interests. That's true, right? You maybe pursue your interest, I maybe pursue mine. Collectively, maybe we hash it out. But when you're talking about thousands upon thousands of innocent civilians getting killed, and many of the others that aren't being hugely traumatized, displaced, all the critical infrastructure destroyed, one of the biggest refugee crises in modern times, you might say that we need to do better, right? We need to do better than having a system at this level of reality that is completely partial. It's not impartial. It's completely partial. And what's to say that at some point this couldn't be, Russia invading Finland or Sweden, or what's to say it couldn't be a Western power invading a country as has happened in the Middle East? Is it okay in the 21st century that we basically have the law of the jungle still between nations, when in our internal affairs we would never accept that now, right? We have enough of a democratic and judicial due process sensibility that it would seem strange if someone could come and take some of your property, and just because they're stronger and wealthier, you have no recourse to law. Obviously, we have inequalities in terms of people's ability to access the judicial system in domestic contexts, but at least we have a functioning one, right, as we continue to prove it. So then, at this point, you say, well, that's the job of the United Nations, right? That's the job of the United Nations. Well, let's just be blunt. Is it the job of the United Nations? The United Nations has a budget half the size of Minnesota, right? Half the size of a not hugely populous state in the US, which is one of 50 states. So the United Nations neither has the resources or the political authority to intervene in situations like this, right? So what is the reality? If the United Nations wanted to stop this militarily, the United Nations would have to go and lobby a whole set of countries to offer it their soldiers. And typically what this means is it goes to poorer countries, because poorer countries are more willing, because of the economic incentive, they're more willing to put their soldiers on the line to die in peacekeeping missions on behalf of the United Nations. Where it's different is when there's a Western-led desire to invade or to stand up militarily, right? An alliance that's normally built by Washington and London and other such capitals. Then those countries send their people, right? But often it's done under a UN resolution authority if it's forthcoming. But you also know, and you remember in the war in Iraq, it wasn't forthcoming, and the West went and did it anyway. So we basically still have complete power politics at that level. If there's going to be an actual military force, it normally needs the West to already be behind it. And if it isn't, the UN with its, frankly, from a global military perspective, ridiculously small budget, it can't do anything meaningfully, right? It can appeal to our moral sensibilities, right? It has some credibility, and hopefully over the years and decades it grows. It has some credibility as a for the sake of humanity moral voice, right? Moral and political voice. Now, there's also lots of people that, particularly in this country, think of the UN as a sort of illegitimate authority, right? Because at times it wants to go against national sovereignty and say, hey, this is on behalf of humanity, or this is a humanitarian issue, or the UN has a thing called R2P, responsibility to protect. What are the conditions under which it's actually okay to go and mess in the internal affairs of a country because it's killing its own citizens, or it's not preventing an internal civil war, right? So there's lots of thought that goes into what is the moral argument to intervene, and we have, and I'm not an expert on this, but we have, various conditions that need to be met, which as a layperson you might understand as there's a level of violence and chaos happening, or minority oppression, or ethnic cleansing in its worst form. And when that happens, under this protocol, you could say there's a right to effect. Now, again, it's only going to happen if there is enough of an alliance between countries that are typically wealthy and powerful enough to say, hey, we're going to get involved and do it, and we know that when we do it, we're not going to get pushback from the big players on the block, right? So you're probably not going to get a smaller contingent of poorer countries sending their soldiers if broadly the West is against that kind of action, right? So now you might say, well, this is the state of the world, right? When you're the big players, you get to call the shots, But actually part of becoming better humans and part of living with agreements between us and processes for dealing when those agreements break down or we can't come to an agreement, is actually that we do better than might is right. And that's really the fundamental question beneath this, is questions about power and sovereignty, might is right versus due process, justice, and something that's more impartial, and how can we have that between countries? So if the United Nations doesn't cut it, because by the way, what is the United Nations? You know, it's a far-thinking organization, an idea. 1945, at the end of World War II, it was the best political compromise that could come up with at the time, with the state of play at the time. A lot of people at the time wanted to go further, right? A lot of people at the time, including people in the US, including US senators and US House of Representatives, wanted to commit to the idea that there would be some kind of limited authority entity that could decide in cases of war and peace, and could decide what to do with these ridiculously destructive and powerful nuclear weapons, right? And there was a moment at the end of World War II where people, many of them were, and lots of people weren't, but there were many people that were pushing for that kind of vision, right? Then the Cold War happens, and that moment has never really reopened. So 1945, the founding of the United Nations, because I actually went to the 70th anniversary back in 2015 in San Francisco of the founding of the United Nations. So it was founded in San Francisco in 1945 under this political compromise. So we've got 5 countries, the so-called victors of World War II, China, Russia, US, UK, and they kind of extended an invitation to the French, even though the French were obviously occupied and kind of devastated in World War II. So these 5 countries sit on they call it the P5, the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, and all those countries have a veto. So anytime the UN Security Council goes to issue a resolution saying, we call for X, or we're going to justify authorizing this kind of military action, any one of those 5 can veto it. And historically, the US, China, and Russia have a record of using their veto to veto things that aren't in their strategic interest, right? Again, maybe that's their prerogative, but you and I can look at that and say, well, in this situation, right, where clearly we want these hostilities to end, and clearly there needs to be some kind of negotiated settlement that might allow both sides to sign on to something. We could talk more about what that needs to look like, but in this instance, Russia vetoes anything that comes out of the Security Council. So we knew, even before all the speeches, all the blah, 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 we knew that this was going to be a completely ineffective political process, right? Everyone knows it. Every head of state knows it. Everyone at the UN knows it. So is it right that you and I continue to, in a sense, live in the unreality that we have a system to deal with this stuff? Because we don't have a system to deal with this stuff, right? So what are we going to do about that? Now, that's a difficult question. I don't have all the answers to that, but we need to be in that conversation, because the people of Ukraine right now, they need a better situation than that. And, there are many countries that could say, okay, you're getting really up in arms about everything that's happened in Ukraine. It dominates the global media cycle, but what's been happening in our country has been going on for the same amount of time, and, there are many situations like this where we need a better way of handling them, So I'm curious if eventually we could have a system that doesn't, so one thing we could do is we could reform the UN Security Council, and we could remove that veto. Now, none of the P5 will ever go for that. And it's tricky because those are all really powerful countries, right? But there may be a way that we can build a popular constituency to say, well, actually, that's not a fair way of proceeding, and sometimes you have to give something up, right? So the risk is that you give something up, right? You give up some of your sovereignty. But the gain is that, because let's also be clear, all of us are paying for the war in Ukraine right now, right? Now, I'm not paying anywhere near as dearly as the people in Ukraine, right? Some of them are paying with their lives, many of them are paying with their homes, many of them are paying with their lost communities, infrastructure, all sorts of things, right? But ultimately the West, and most of you listening to this right now are probably in the West, in the global North. We are funding Ukraine in this war, right? And maybe that's the moral thing to do. Maybe it is. will fund the reconstruction of Ukraine, right? So your tax and my tax will go to pay for this war. So even if you were doing this from a completely non-humanitarian, fully self-interested perspective, you might say, do I want a situation where instead of it going to this level of destructive violence, actually I want to pay to be part of an apparatus to deal with this much more humanely and effectively, right? That's why you and I, in our tax dollars, pay for the court system, right? It doesn't get talked about much, but it's probably something like, $1 a day. I might be out, but maybe I'm not out by 10 times magnitude, that people pay to have a functioning judicial system. So if you ever get accused of a crime, there's a system to deal for it. If someone commits a crime against you, there's a system for dealing. Now, it's not perfect. But ultimately, that's the conversation that people aren't saying. Because we don't have a functioning judicial system at the global level, this will get paid for directly through, your tax dollars are paying for anti-tank defense systems, probably surface-to-air missiles, intelligence, all sorts of things. You're also paying for it because of the increase in global food prices and other commodity prices. And you'll also pay for it because you'll pay for the rebuilding. And maybe that's absolutely fair. But maybe you would want to be part of a system where we could actually reduce that cost super significantly on the front end by saying we're going to force these people to come to the table. Because this is the bit that probably isn't acknowledged in the Western political and media narrative, is it could just be true that there are some legitimate grievances or legitimate security concerns that Russia has. Whatever you think of Putin and whatever you think of the hideousness of war, that could be true, because just probably if it were on the other foot, right, and there was a hugely powerful military alliance that was on the doorsteps of a Western power, probably that Western power, if it were powerful enough, it wouldn't actually go for it, right? So this is the argument that when, for example, Russia, USSR, back in the day, was putting nuclear weapons into Cuba, America was like, no, you don't get to do that. That's in our backyard, right? Now, Ukraine is a huge country, and it is also in Russia's backyard, and we might want a situation where Russia says, well, that's fine. Ukraine's an independent country; it gets to decide its own future, right? But Ukraine also has aspirations towards the European Union. Ukraine also has aspirations towards the United Nations, towards NATO. And again, you might say an independent country gets to choose that, right? But if this were on the other foot, if every country surrounding the UK or the US was turning towards a communist ideology backed by China that involved Chinese materiel and troops on the ground in those countries, they wouldn't go for it. They just wouldn't go for it. They would do all sorts of things to prevent that happening, including keeping military options on the table, right? Or including, covert operations to destabilize countries or create coups, all sorts of things that the West has done in its history, And I'm not saying this as a whole strain of anti-Western rhetoric. I'm just saying we've got to be honest about where we're at. And one of the great traditions of the West is that we discuss things and that we try to improve upon our lot as rationally as we can. This is not a rational way of proceeding. If you hear Putin talk about North Korea, another country that's, has nuclear aspirations, run by a dictator, he said this in an interview with the Financial Times I listened to. He said that the first question really is, does North Korea feel safe? It's not about whether it has nuclear weapons or not, right? Russia, whether you think it's legitimate or not, under his leadership doesn't feel safe. And you might say there's a decent reason for that, because Russia doesn't look at democratic Western values as a good thing, right? Just in the same way that at a domestic level, when let's say in the US, right, when the Democrats move to do something that, if you understand the heart of what they're trying to do, it seems about improving the lot of marginalized groups. Oftentimes, from a more conservative perspective, We don't care the good thing that you think you're trying to do. What we see is this is a power grab, right? This gives you more control over our lives, and we don't want that, right? When Russia looks at NATO, it doesn't look at it and say, that's so great that you're collectivizing your security. It says this is the world's most powerful military alliance, bar none, ever in history, and it's gradually getting closer to our borders. And we also are a nuclear power, and we probably don't feel like you're treating us as equal partners at the table, right? If you look at Putin's interview, whether you believe him or not, he uses this word partners. I happen to think he might believe that means something in his world, right? That actually we get a say in things because we're treating each other as partners. So he warned after the 2008, right, there was a NATO conference. I think it's the Bucharest conference. After that, NATO announced that Georgia and Ukraine would be put on the possible path to NATO membership. Russia made it clear then it wasn't happy with that. And again, you can debate whether that's legitimate or not, but even in the sort of Western moral toolkit, I don't think Western countries go for ever increasing power from ideologies they don't like on their own doorstep. Now, mostly the West hasn't had to deal with that in quite the same way. Probably the main way it's had to deal with that in recent decades is Russia, right? But actually, if you look over time, right, the West has just continued to grow in its power and in its powering of globalization, and Russia economically, just hasn't fared as well, right? So the power differential has grown, right? Now, again, you might say, well, that's maybe a good thing because the West has values that I like, and more freedom, and the EU is a good thing. Okay, but from a Russian perspective, none of that really counts. They're not looking at those values as a good thing. What they're looking at it is as a power situation, and through the lens of power, this is what's happening. And now you want to add one more country that's traditionally been the kind of buffer between the kind of the West and the East in this instance. We're not going to go for that. And we've told you that as far back as 2008 and probably as far back as the 1990s when we were talking about our own security guarantees and what NATO would and wouldn't do. And apparently NATO had promised to the Russians that it wouldn't seek eastward expansion. And since then, it has expanded, I don't know the exact number, but 5 to 10 countries have joined the NATO alliance, right? All pushing it further east and closer to Russia's borders. So actually, in this instance, it doesn't seem like the West has even upheld its own part of the bargain, right? Now, maybe that stuff never made it into formalized treaties. Maybe that was one leader, right? Maybe I don't know, maybe George Bush Sr., right, was of that view, but maybe Clinton wasn't, right? Or maybe George Bush Jr. wasn't, or Obama or Trump. And that's fair. That does happen, right? It's one of the sort of regrettable things in some ways in international relations is that it can change so much depending on who's in power. But maybe you'd also say that's democracy at work. But in this instance, that democracy at work has been at the expense of the guarantees that Russia wanted in order to feel safe, right? And if we just bring this back into the kind of work that we talk a bit more regularly on this channel, right? Each of us wants to feel safe, right? You have a set of conditions under which you feel safe, right? Safe, and let's add another word in here, respected. So what has you feel safe and respected, right? It may be that you feel safe and respected when someone looks you in the eye. It may be that you feel safe and respected when someone's open to you energetically or smiles at you, or when you can feel the goodness of their heart. Or you may feel safe and respected when someone just leaves you alone, right? Don't look at me. Don't talk to me. Just you do your thing and I'll do mine, right? Good fences, good neighbors. I don't need to know anything about you. I don't need to hear from you. Just leave me alone, right? So you can see automatically, even at this just simple person to person, you can be wildly different in what has us feel safe, right? Sometimes it's non-intervention. For some people, if you do leave them alone, they don't feel safe, right? They feel ignored. They feel disrespected. They don't know where you stand. They don't know what your heart's about. They don't know what you're going to do next, right? Now, let's say you're triggered. What do you need when you're triggered? For some people, when they're triggered, they need space. For some people, when they're triggered, they need comfort, contact, and reassurance. Right, so what Russia, and we'll just call Russia Putin, just for simplicity at this moment of time. That's a collapsing, but maybe it's not an unjustifiable collapsing. What does he and Russia need to feel safe, right? And the starting point might have to be what they think and need, and rather than what you imagine, right? If you say, well, gosh, if Ukraine deciding its own future and that it wants to align with the West and not you, if that has you not feel safe, screw you, go to your therapist, right? But that's not really how it works in state relations. And rightly or wrongly, Russia feels it should have a say in that. And what is that forum, right? Maybe it's the United Nations, but it's a little bit of a talking shop in the sense it doesn't have the ability to bind, to put troops on the ground, to enforce, right? And all the other functioning states in the world have an executive that can enforce, right? Can say, no, you can't do that. Yes, we can raise taxes on you. Sorry, if you're going to treat people that way, we can put you in through the judicial system, we can put you in jail. There's all set of processes that exist that just don't really exist at the global level, And obviously there'd be huge risks in putting some of this infrastructure in place, but then they're not risks that I think are worse than what we're dealing with at the moment, right? Possible crimes against humanity, and we've been impotent basically to stop that, right? We're doing our best to de-escalate it by not getting involved. But that actually at some point, for things to de-escalate, there has to be the ability to intervene and get involved, right? Otherwise, you're effectively bystanders. So we could reform the UN in the fullness of time to give it more teeth, to allow it to actually enforce, to allow it to put peacekeeping troops in rapidly and decisively, right? Rather than, let me give you another analogy, right? If your house is on fire, do you want to have to go door to door to every neighbor to say, could you chip into the pot? And could you possibly give me your, son, daughter, spouse, brother, sister to come be part of a crew? Okay, great. Let's go around, talk to the next. By the time it's happened, your house is burnt down, right? Which is what's happening in Ukraine, right? By the time the UN would go around to try and raise the donations, to try and lobby typically to the poorer countries to give their soldiers for a peacekeeping mission, Ukraine is absolutely devastated, right? And any country looking to invade another country knows that the UN cannot bring rapid and decisive force to the table. Now, you might be someone that advocates for the abolition of war, right? I don't want a world in which war happens. And wouldn't that be a great world to live in? The question is, how do you actually get there, right? How do you take that as an idealistic position and deliver it through actual hard, realistic, meeting reality where it is, right? Because we talk about that on this channel a lot is, we've got to start from here, right? It's an old, terrible joke, racist joke, British joke about the Irish. You go and ask an Irish person for directions and they say, oh, you don't want to start here, you want to start over there, right? In life and in politics, you can't just start over there. You've got to start here, right, with the realities as they are, and you've got to meet the world. And in your personal growth, you've got to do the same thing. So if you're going to meet the world where it's at, what does that actually look like? What does that actually look like? You might feel like the sort of conversation I'm in, maybe it's I don't know, maybe it occurs to you as abstract, right? Maybe it's like a bit over your head, right? If there's some of this stuff you haven't thought about. I'm just opening up the possibility that you might think about it, because I believe there will be a moment in time where there is an opening for putting the actual mechanisms in place that would deliver on the thing that you want, right? You want a world where war doesn't exist, right? Most rational people would actually want that as well. Right? Even people whose whole orientation and maybe family for generations is oriented towards the military, right? Often people in the military know that the value of peace, right? Because they've actually gone into war zones, they've lost friends, they've lost family members, they know the devastation of war. The thing that mitigates the need for war is diplomacy, and it's also law and due process. Right? So we don't hear enough in this whole narrative, right, that basically this is a Russian war of aggression and that Russia's bad and the West is good, right? And there may be some truth in that, maybe a lot of truth in that, but I don't think it's fully sufficient, because the bit that's missed out is, well, how would we actually stop this happening, right? If there's bad people in the world, right? And I happen to believe that it's a little more complex sometimes than these are the bad people and these are the good people, right? That is a reality. It's a certain narrative. It's simplistic and it's potent. You and I know from the work that we do that you and I have light and dark within us, right? So there's also something that up levels in our narrative when we acknowledge the darkness and the badness isn't just out there, it's also in here, right? Not in a way that I need to let my inner critic run the show and beat me up, right? But actually I just can kind of acknowledge it. Yeah, maybe some of my impulses aren't always the most altruistic, right? Maybe I do have some self-interest. Maybe I do have a self-serving bias, which most of us have, right? Maybe I do have places where I feel powerless. And actually sometimes when I feel powerless, maybe even if it's just silently and internally, I feel aggressive, or I feel vengeful, or I feel, or I go snide, right? And I get sarcastic and I say snarky thoughts, even if they're just in my head, right? I think any of us, envy, jealousy, pride, vanity, you know, the 7 deadly sins plus, we all have these. There's a reason that they exist. You know? The question is, can we come together collectively and put structures and processes and culture in place that means that the better angels of our nature, so to speak, can prevail? And we don't have that in these situations. There used to be the McDonald's theory, right? The McDonald's theory is if we have enough capitalism, right, when we can, as a proxy for capitalism, we'll just say, do you have McDonald's in your country? You know, countries that have enough capitalism don't go to war, right? And then that was kind of shattered when Russia invaded Crimea, part of Ukraine, back in 2014, because Russia, like Ukraine, has McDonald's. No, maybe there's something in it that countries that fully believe in capitalist liberal democracies, at a certain point in their evolution, they don't go to war because they realize that the heavy cost of war, and they're so deeply embedded in mutual processes of trade and globalization that it just doesn't make sense. So they find other ways through, you know, bilateral and multilateral and international membership organizations to kind of hash out their differences. And yes, some of those processes exist, but when the chips are down, what's actually happening is we still have war on the table, right? So to me, it doesn't make sense to say, well, I'm anti-war or I'm pro-war, right? That seems like a very limited frame for me, right? The vast majority of people don't want war, but you can't probably just be anti-war unless you're willing to put an actual solution on the table. Right? So, and you might say, well, I just don't see there's any need for this. You know, we could sit down, we could sort out our differences. Well, what does that actually look like? You know, because at the moment we call that the United Nations, and it ain't working. So we need something better. So that's where I'm trying to bring a little bit of like the hard edge into the conversations, to say you don't have the privilege to just be anti-war, as long as there's not an actual solution in place that stops it, right? That's the kind of cold hard edge of this. What are we actually going to do? What kind of constituency could you and I be part of that when the moment in time comes says, you know what, yeah, actually having an international criminal court in The Hague for leaders who have perpetrated these sort of crimes against humanity, that's actually a good thing. I'm for that. And when my country, right, and many of you watching this right now will be in a country that is not a signatory to the International Criminal Court, right? So check that out, particularly any of you that are in the US. If your country isn't a signatory to that, then, you know, it's kind of like the double standard, right? We want this for leaders of other countries, right? And this is why African countries have an issue with this, because they say, well, who gets tried at the International Criminal Court? It just seems to be African leaders. You know, what about Western leaders? What about, you know, these wars that seem to us to be wars of aggression? Surely they could be investigated as well. So we've got further to go with that. But ultimately, you don't get to say this is a process for you, but I don't want to participate, right? I don't get to say to you, oh, it's great that you want to have a court system, but I'm above that. That doesn't really work. So we all need to be part and parcel of it. So you might want to lobby your own leaders, right, at the national level to say, actually, we should be part of this, right? We should operate by this standard, because what we get by creating legitimacy for these kind of global institutions, even though you're right, we give up a little bit of our sovereignty, but maybe we also gain that we don't have to pay for, fund, watch, and on our watch, in a sense, share the responsibility for what's happening in Ukraine, right? That's the shift, in a sense. When you feel powerless, you just being, and again, not in an itacritic shame way, but just acknowledging you and I are part of that problem, right? You and I haven't yet found a way to empower our governments to create a solution where this kind of thing is in the history books and it's anachronistic, and your anti-war stance can have teeth. It can be real, not just ideal, but an actual lived reality. Right, so we don't tend to think of it like that, right? We tend to think, oh, there's a war going on over there, and it sort of impacts me, maybe like in some food prices and some gas pumps, and maybe I have a view on it, right? Maybe we should be, maybe I live in a Western country, and I'm sort of thinking, well, should we be sending troops? Should we engage? I don't want to have a nuclear war. Is it okay that Western countries are giving intelligence to Ukraine? Like, you might have a view on all of that. But there's also this reality, if you don't think of government as separate from its people, right, which is, I think, one of the fallacies that we live into, that it's the government over there and I'm the people over here, that actually there's a mutually interdependent relationship and mutually constitutive relationship between those two things. If that's true, then you and I are part of this, right? As I say, your euros, pounds, dollars, however you pay your tax, is funding part of what's happening in this. Right? Your representatives that you put into office are making decisions right now that will impact whether the impacts that are happening in Ukraine. So we're very much part of this, and I'm inviting you to at least be part of the constituency and conversation that says, if we want an end to this, we actually need to think about creating processes of peace and justice that everyone can sign on to, right? Because that's basically the best way that we know how to mitigate, de-escalate, and preempt violence is by having structures of due process, peace, and justice, right? There is no peace without justice, right? And if people don't have a way to get justice, they get violent. We know that, right? We know that's what pretty much every judicial system is based upon, that kind of understanding. And so how could there be some kind of just process where whoever needs to be involved, but in this instance, the Russians, the Ukrainians, or other countries that are more intimately involved in this, could actually sit down and find a solution to this that doesn't mean that they need to go to war, right? I don't believe that existed, and correct me if I'm wrong. I'm learning. I'm not here just to kind of spiel. I'm being a bit spiely this morning. I'm being a bit ranty. I care about this stuff. I care about inviting you into the conversation, because most of us are experiencing this as kind of passive bystanders and victims, and I get it. I've been in that. I've had a lot of powerlessness in this as well, so none of that's judgmental. It's just, in my better moments, I want to take that fear, that anger, that hurt, that sense of injustice and do something with it, right? Because this is people's lives. This is our world, This is our world. It belongs to all of us. And yeah, shit. It matters. This stuff matters. And it's not getting talked about, to me, in a way that seems intelligent and fair and actually honoring. It's like there's a big part of the pie of this issue that just doesn't even get talked about. It's just not even on people's agendas, right? So it then gets down into the victim triangle, right? Victim triangle. There's a perpetrator, there's a victim, and then we're going to try and come in. This is what this is in some ways, right? Ukraine is the victim, and I'm not saying this is in some ways isn't true, right? There might be partial truth in this, but when we're only in this perspective, it's limited. Ukraine is the victim, Russia is the perpetrator, and the West is the hero, right? And we're going to try and do our best to come and support and save. And maybe we can do better than that, right? Maybe we can start to put these things on a narrative that's a little bit more inclusive, right? Because there are victims of this. Obviously, the Russian people are victims of this, right? And you might even say, if you look at the narrative of NATO expansion, you might just say Russia is a victim. In some ways, Russia is a victim, right? Even if it's just a victim of being more powerful to less powerful, or even if it's a victim of not being able to prevent the gathering and growing of the largest ever military alliance on its doorstep. Maybe it could be a friend to that alliance. The alliance maybe in the fullness of time could even welcome them, right? Maybe that would even be possible. Maybe that's even been talked about at some point. But that alliance is very raison d'etre. It's a bit French. Is to counter Russian, influence. Is to contain Russia. That's really what NATO is about. It's not an alliance that looks equally in every single direction. It looks very specifically in one direction. And again, you might say from history that's important, that's been needed. But if you're Russia, how are you going to feel about that, right? And at some point, a war of aggression isn't because you're inherently aggressive. That's not the only reason. A war of aggression just as much comes from what? Because you're afraid. I can see that in myself, and I've talked about that. I can talk to people who've talked about situations where they're incredibly afraid and they've been at their most aggressive, right? So what would happen if we actually lent a listening ear to the part, right? You and I talk about parts within ourselves, the part of Russia, whether that's just, Putin or some people in his leadership. But I actually think there's a decent amount, whether you think it's only propaganda or not, but there's probably a decent amount of Russians that share some of these concerns. They don't look at the West as some impartial, higher moral authority. They look at the West as foreign, right? And anything that is foreign to you is generally scary, right? Even that word, when it's that's foreign, you don't think, yay, foreign. It's like foreign, right? There's an impact to that. So they're looking at this foreign thing growing. Maybe it's legitimate that a part of them feels afraid, right? Even if it includes, misinformation and misunderstanding. But maybe there's also part of it that sees sort of clearly, like, there is a very powerful force amassing on our borders. How do we feel about that? And by the way, this very powerful force is it is a raid against you, right? Whether you like that or not, whether you even had an involvement in that or not. So if we could actually have a little bit more respect and understanding for that, maybe we could deal with this in a different way. Right now, it could be that this is just such a 19th century power politics play that the only thing that Putin's ever going to understand is a show of force, and maybe that's true, right? But I think people also need to be heard, and we need to be able to separate out grievances that are legitimate from maybe ones that are like outlandish and based on some kind of misinformation. That might be a starting point. So, yeah. What's something that you could do right now? You could just familiarize yourself with the mechanics of the UN Security Council, right? Just understanding how it works, that there are these 5 permanent members, that there is a campaign to reform the United Nations. But I also have an intuition for you, which is this ultimately will need to go further than the reformation of the United Nations. That ultimately it will need some kind of deeper transformation, basically, and some kind of up-leveling of institutional structures so that we can actually handle this. So even if you did nothing than just sit with the idea, could you ever imagine the legitimacy of an international or global structure that had the resources to deal with something like this and come to a judicial negotiated settlement? Could you live with that? Do you think that's a good idea? Because I'm sort of saying if you want to bang the peace drum, it's so much better if you can also come with an understanding of what that peace might take, and be part of the conversation. As always, questions and comments beneath this video. I'm sure I've made huge omissions here, and I'm open to seeing them. There's obviously going to be ways that I've simplified and reduced narratives. There may be ways that you feel like I'm giving credence to things that you have thought of as, well, that's just evil. And maybe I'm not even close enough sometimes to fully know. But I also sense that we want to bring more and more people into the fold, right? Sort of meaning we want to have more and more people inside of a way of proceeding with each other that tends towards more peaceful outcomes. And so if you remove people from inside a status, right? If you remove people from, if you exclude people, ultimately, I think you have less way of impacting them. So I don't ultimately like the idea that there are certain countries that are getting isolated from the international system, unless that is genuinely leading towards better outcomes and reformation, but I happen to think it makes people more paranoid, more isolated, and probably therefore ultimately more aggressive, So, yeah, that's what I got. As always, I'm Jack. Thanks for being here.